Good morning, everyone. Great to have you all here. My name's Megan Lawson. I'm the CEO of COTA New South Wales. If you're a regular attendee of our webinars, you'll know I'm not the regular host. Joan Hughes, our COTA New South Wales president, usually hosts these, but unfortunately she is off today with COVID. She's resting up at home. So she's asked me to pass on her apologies to all of you. She's starting to feel better, but she currently has a cough as one of her symptoms, and she didn't think it was a great idea to try and host something that she had to talk all the way through while she was coughing, as she is. So welcome to the webinar today. We're glad that you can join us. I can see that people are coming into the room now. We're expecting more people, so I assume that people will keep joining us for the next few minutes, but we're going to have a great discussion today. We've got some excellent panelists to talk to us, and we are looking forward to having a discussion about the things that we've found in our latest 50+ report. So COTA undertakes a large survey every year. It's one of the annual pieces of work that we do. And this year we wanted to challenge some of the assumptions that exist on what older people think on a range of topics. Since I started working in this space, it's obvious that there are lots of stereotypes about older people, and it affects people's lives in lots of different ways. But it also affects policy debate, and it's used as a wedge when we start talking about solutions to some of the wicked policy issues that we are dealing with at the moment. There's a dominant narrative of the socially conservative older person, the selfish baby boomer, I'm sure you've all heard it, and lots of other negative descriptors that get thrown around. These presumptions are based on generalities and simplification. The truth is obviously always far more complex. As with any other age group, older people hold a diverse range of views and attitudes and beliefs that are influenced by their gender, their age, their experiences, their education, their cultural background, their income, and their geographic location. So today we're going to be looking at exploring the results of the survey we undertook late last year. The survey was more than 6,000 people. We also did a range of focus groups to really tease out some of the issues that we were talking to people about. And we want to explore those today with our panelists. This report explored older people's thoughts on a range of topics, including the use of technology, Indigenous recognition, cultural diversity, climate change, how older people consume news, intergenerational conflict, and the representation of older people in the media. We'll present some of the results throughout the webinar and open it up to our panelists for discussion. We have some really knowledgeable speakers with us today, and I encourage you to ask questions through the chat or Q&A, and I can see that there are things coming through on the chat already. So today we're lucky enough to have with us Faye Akindoyi, Auntie Norma Ingram, Jenna Price, and Lex Maranos, and I'll introduce you to them all as we go through, but they're all going to be part of the conversation on the report. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we are all on this morning. I'm on Gadigal country. I'm in the middle of the city in Sydney, and I'm lucky to live and work on Gadigal country. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to extend that respect to all the First Nations people who are joining us here today. For those of you who aren't sure, COTA stands for Council on the Ageing. We're the peak organisation for people over 50 in New South Wales. We're a policy and advocacy organisation. We work with politicians, policymakers, service providers, and the media to make sure the views of older people are heard and acted on. We also provide a range of services for older people, including the Legal Pathways Program, the Aged Care Navigator Service, and the Living Longer, Living Stronger program, as well as the Older Men New Ideas groups that run right around New South Wales, and the Community Speakers Program. Quick bit of Zoom housekeeping, although we're all much better at it than we were when we started doing these webinars. All of you are on mute. Only the presenters are able to unmute and to speak. You can ask questions through the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. You just click on that and you can type your questions in. You can also upvote questions. If you really see one there that you would really like to see answered, you can upvote that there. You can also add comments into the chat section, as chat box, and I can see some of you saying hello, so welcome this morning, and thanks for sharing the lands that you're coming from this morning. And we'll be answering some of those questions if we can get to them during the discussion session. This event is being recorded. If you have to leave early, you'll be able to catch up on the COTA New South Wales YouTube channel, and we keep all of our webinars there. So we're very pleased to be launching our latest report this morning. The report's called What Older People Think. And as I said earlier, the report is based on an extensive survey of more than 6,000 people around New South Wales, conducted late last year, and then a series of focus groups. The report challenges many of the assumptions that are often made about older people. Older people aren't one homogenous group. You don't get to 50 and just become like every other older person in New South Wales. They hold a diverse range of views, just like all of those people under 50. We found differences based on age, based on gender, geographic location, and income. We think this research provides important insights for decision makers and for the broader population, that they need to acknowledge the diversity of older people's experiences, socioeconomic and stage of life, and continually challenge the assumptions they hold on what older people think. The report is available on our website, and a link has been put into the chat box for you, but it will also be in the email that we send out on the other end of this webinar. So to start us off this morning, we've asked Faye to give us a bit of an overview of the election campaign as she sees it at the moment, and particularly as it relates to older people. Faye has over 20 years experience in strategic communications. She's worked on some of the most challenging briefs in Australia. She's one of the country's most sought after communication consultants and has a deep understanding of the nexus between policy, politics and business, having spent 15 years in public affairs, including 5 years in Canberra, leading a bipartisan team of top government relations experts. She's a partner at Sec Newgate. We work with her on some of our other work, and she's also a regular commentator on the drums. So Faye, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Megan, and morning, everybody. Really pleased to be here. I've got a deck to share, if that's helpful for people. Let me see if I can get it up now without causing any challenges, she says, with hope in her heart. And I'll flick it over to that mode. So hopefully people will be able to see this. Is that clear?
Perfect, thank you.
Thanks, Megan. So let me kick off. Oops, it's running itself at the moment, which is great. Let me just go back a little bit on that. I keep being asked this question. I'll kick off by saying, give you some of the basics, the metrics on this. And I know people on this webinar have a good understanding and appreciation of the political environment and our democratic structures here in Australia. But just as a little bit of a reminder, there's about 17 million Australians who are eligible to vote. Fascinatingly, the pre-polls have been open for a week and they've already received 1.7 million pre-polls. The Electoral Commission has received 2.5 million applications for postal votes, of which 900,000 have been lodged already. These are big numbers. There is an expectation that the Electoral Commission is modelling potentially as many as 45% of the voters coming in prior to the actual polls on Saturday, which is a stunning figure. Historically, we've been running at state elections in the last few rounds, about 30% of people have polled prior to the Saturday, posted their vote prior to the Saturday. So if we get up to 40% in this election, which is quite likely, that means that the Commission has to manage all that processing. And they're going to start opening the ballots for the first time in pre-poll from 4 p.m. on Saturday, which will be great because it'll take them that long to undo the envelopes and lay them all out. So if anyone on this call has ever done scrutineering or helped out with the Electoral Commission, you'll appreciate the logistical challenge this is going to represent. So we're sitting at 2 days left of a very long 6 weeks. And if you're like me, it's felt incredibly long. The main takeaways so far have been pretty interesting in the sense of the focus around cost of living. The focus has been around climate change. It's been very much a character contest between the two leaders. The independents have played a really important role, and we'll talk a bit more about them later. But there's been not a lot of substantive historical kind of issues, debates that we've seen in the past. There's no clear discussion around taxes, which is, most people know in 2019 was a significant issue, particularly the franking credits. No clear debate focusing on debt no clear debate focusing on productivity and IR, which is our historical, platforms. There has been a lot of influence by external events, the war in the Ukraine, concerns about China, RBA cash rates, all these things have had their influence on the campaign. So this is what the most recent news poll says. Based on this, where Labor is ahead on two-party preferred, 54 to 46, that would give them 87 seats in the House of Reps. And as you know, the House of Reps has actually increased to 151 seats now. So, and you need 79 to hold government and offer up a chair. So that gives Labor, at least as far as the polls are concerned, a massive majority. But as we all know, polling has undergone a lot of issues in recent years, which relate to a whole range of factors, but they have improved their techniques since 2019. There's been a lot of work going into that space. But the big concern for the two parties around these results is how low their primary vote is. In Labor's case, their primary vote is running at about 38%. And for the coalition, the primary vote is running at 35%. That's a real concern. That means there's a whacking 30% of the population have turned to some other political representative. But also, most importantly for the coalition, they've never won an election where their primary vote is under 40. The last time it was lower than 40 was in 1946. So the path ahead for them, the challenge that they have to overcome is huge. They've also got this, by comparison, even though the polls are showing that the two parties are coming closer together, and that it always tightens in the last few days before the actual election, even though the polls are showing that, in 2019, there was only a 4-point difference between themselves and Labor going into these final days. Currently, they're living with a whacking 8%, and that's a big call. As you know, the House of Reps, 151, you got 76 seats. Senate, we're sitting there. One of the interesting things that's going to happen is no matter who wins, they're going to have a Senate which is more challenging to navigate because there's going to be an increased number of independents. So the Greens are going to play a powerful role in the Senate. They are expected to increase their position, and they are also expected to, if Labor can hold from its current 26 and maybe hold on to get no lower than 23, there's a potential that the Greens will have 12 senators. So combined with Labor, just enough with one or two of the independents to have a consistent coalition to get policy through. But at what cost? Unlike previous government Senate compositions, one of the advantages that Labor would have is if it was having to negotiate with a Senate, it would actually have enough like-minded senators, even in this, the independent and the Greens areas, that they could consistently navigate both houses. Where in the past, they could get things through in the House of Reps, but then when it got to the Senate, the composition of the Senate was so in opposite political disposition that it was almost impossible to get things through in a consistent way. Another big change for this election is just the staggering number of seats that are in play. This is just a small portion. We've never had so many marginals in an election that are genuinely being contested. So for New South Wales, there's been periods during this election in which the belief has been that New South Wales will either win or lose the election for the successful government. Not sure that's going to be the case quite so much in this election. There are so many new variables going on, and I'll talk about the independents in a minute. A couple of things though that you could probably use as a pointer. One is on Saturday night, if it looks like the coalition is going to be returned, we'll know really quickly, because most of the seats that they need to pick up are sitting on the eastern seaboard, and they come from seats which have booths which are medium in size, which tends to mean counting can happen quickly. If it turns out to be a tighter contest, then West Australia becomes more important. And that means the night is going to be drawn out. So if Labor basically is inching ahead, it will mean a long night for all of us on Saturday. And in fact, it may mean, because of the large number of postals in truly minority seats, it may actually mean that we won't know for a few days, which I'm sure for some of you will be the most painful experience in a long time. But this is the exciting new factor in our election, the role that these organised, cashed up independents are playing. I often believe that the Teal candidates are to the coalition what the Greens were to Labor 20 years ago. They have appeared to contest the heartland. They are taking the progressive side of the party and saying, actually, you, the progressives, are not fighting the fight inside the caucus enough to get the issues that we think this electorate cares about prosecuted. So some of the safest Liberal seats are up for a battle for the first time. And even if they're not successful in winning, and some of them are genuinely contestable, but even if they're not successful, they have taken resources and attention that the coalition has not had to invest in the past. So they're going to be a real game changer. And we can have a long conversation about the various scenarios of if they get up, like if Monique Ryan gets up in Kooyong and Josh is no longer in the party, what does that mean in terms of the broad mix within the Liberal coalition and future leadership consequences? There's also independent seats who are not Teal candidates who are genuinely contesting, like the seat of Nichols here in Victoria, which is out at Shepparton Way. There is a very, very strong independent running there against the Nationals, and he could take that out as well. So it's going to be a fascinating side contest to watch. Last thing, the campaign itself. I just remind people a couple of things. In politics, there is two agendas. There is the political agenda, and then there's the policy agenda. According to the political agenda, this is what the two leaders have been running on. You know, Morrison did it. He delivered a miracle in 2019. He can do it again. He can change. It's not easy under Albanese. It sounds like something my daughter used to say at kids in playgrounds. It doesn't really sound like a mature campaign slogan, but it may be having an impact. They're saying the other side, you shouldn't risk them. They've delivered things like AUKUS, they're experienced, safe pair of hands. On Albanese's side, he's saying, listen, Scott Morrison has been examined and found wanting. And they've very much focused their attention on him and the broad areas of dissatisfaction in certain segments around Scott Morrison's performance over the last 3 years. The care economy and its importance is very much part of his narrative. Making things cheaper, addressing the cost of living by actually lifting wages, clean energy, and of course the $19 billion reconstruction fund. From the policies perspective, these things have played out again in starkly different branding. Morrison's on the economy, cost of living, lower taxes, very traditional security, very traditional liberal issues. Labor's talking plan to lift wages, extending the care economy, climate trends. Again, very core traditional things Labor as opposed to be campaigning on. I think a big interest from my perspective at least, I don't know how the rest of you feel about it, was the announcement in the campaign launch by the coalition to use superannuation to help fund first-time home buyers, to help them be able to tap into that. Regardless of whether you think it is good policy, from a political perspective, I thought it was a very smart play by the coalition. It forced people off a whole range of topics which the coalition are weak on. It stopped the conversation around the Teal candidates and their momentum, and it got people to start to talk about those things that the coalition feel that they've got a strong base on. So it may have been enough of a conversation impactor, game changer. We'll see how that goes. The polls will tell us in the next couple of days. So what are the outcomes? What could happen? There's 4 scenarios. There's a Liberal return. There's a ALP majority win. There's a coalition minority. And then there's a ALP government in minority. I suspect the most likely outcome is options 3 or 4. And if you look at those earlier polls, I suspect it's option 4. There's this general phrase being thrown around about a hung parliament. I think it's important to remember that all barring 2 of the last 10 years, basically 11 years, we have had a minority government. So this idea that suddenly it's chaos and cats and dogs on the street and total disruption of life as we know it is really quite a furphy. And history tells us that governments that govern in a minority actually deliver better outcomes because they're forced to negotiate and be sensible and find common ground. And some would say that's exactly what we need right now. So Megan, I hope that has proved interesting.
That's terrific. Thank you, Faye. I think particularly that last slide talking about changes to our political landscape. Have always been a political junkie, and I find this really interesting to see that happening now because it is a really significant change to how we do politics in Australia. So I think when I started working on campaigns, they used to talk about this tiny group in the middle that affected campaigns, and now that group is so much larger. And you know, there's obvious political difficulties with that in terms of being forming a government. But I think for the community, there's lots and lots of opportunities to influence and to be more involved in the process. And I think that's quite exciting. So thanks for that. I hope everyone enjoyed that background. I'm going to ask the other panelists to switch their cameras on now and to get ready because we're going to launch into the discussion now. I'd like to introduce you to the rest of our panel today before we kick off. So we have I don't know if you're all seeing the screen the same as I am, but on the far right of my screen, I have Auntie Norma Ingram. Norma is a Wiradjuri woman. She was born in Cowra, but she's lived most of her life in inner city Redfern. She has extensive and varied resume. She's been the CEO of both the Metropolitan, Local and State Aboriginal Land Councils. She's managed projects with the Department of Premier and Cabinet, and she's done lots of other things as well. She now shares her expertise on several committees and boards, and her role as the chairperson of the Wyanga Aboriginal Elders Program continues to remind her that Aboriginal stories are essential to the continuation of Aboriginal culture and must be passed on to the younger generation. And I'm really pleased that you could join us today, Auntie Norma. We also have Jenna Price. Many of you would know Jenna. She's an Australian journalist and academic. As of 2021. She was a fellow at the Australian National University and a columnist with the Sydney Morning Herald. She's one of the founders of the online feminist movement Destroy the Joint, which gave Alan Jones all kinds of trouble. And like Faye, she's a regular on the drum, and I always enjoy listening to her debating on there. So thanks very much, Jenna, for joining us today. And our last panelist is Lex Maranos. And I was joking with Lex when he got online this morning that I already feel like I know him because I used to watch a lot of Kingswood Country when I was younger. But Lex has had a much more diverse career than that. Lex was born in Wagga on Wiradjuri country into a family of Greek cafe owners. He's worked in all areas of the entertainment industry as an actor, director, writer, broadcaster and teacher, and his work has taken him all over Australia. He currently co-hosts the award-winning program Baby Boomers Guide to Life in the 21st Century for the Community Radio Network. That's a program that's been growing for a number of years now, and it's now syndicated in lots of places around the country. So you may well have heard him in that program. So look, again, thank you all very much for joining us today. Auntie Norma, I might get you to take your mute off now so that we're ready to go. For those of you who watch our regular webinars, we're going to do this a little bit differently today. What we're going to do is go through a series of PowerPoint slides that kind of talk to the major issues in the report. We'll go through them one at a time and have a bit of a discussion about each of those issues. If I could remind you all, I can see some people are doing it now on my other screen over here. You can use the Q&A panel at any time to pop some questions in, and we'll be keeping an eye on that so we try and address those. And you can also make comments in the chat section as well. So Karen, who is on here right now, is going to start sharing the screen for us. So we're not going to get a chance to go through the whole report today. The whole report is quite long. It is available on the website, and I would encourage you all to go and have a look at it after the webinar today. But we are just going to go through some of the top issues, I guess. So the survey asked people in one of the first questions to select their top 3 issues from a list of 14 options. And people were also able to enter their own issues if they thought they weren't being covered by the list that we'd provided for them. So of the 14 options and the various others that were added in there, the top 3 came out as climate change, housing affordability and homelessness, and COVID-19. So almost 52% of people chose climate change as their top issue in the report. There were some differences in age cohorts in these responses. So younger, older people, as we often call them, that 50 to 59 year age group, were more concerned about climate change, and people in the 80 plus cohort were less so. Housing affordability was also of greater concern to women. And I think, you know, it's something that I know that Jenna has talked about quite a bit, but that we know, generally speaking, that older women are the fastest growing group of homeless people in Australia. And that's obviously reflected in women's reflections on housing and affordability and looking at how that works for them. But also people in regional cities were concerned about housing affordability. And I think that's probably a relatively new thing. And I think it really reflects the way that prices have been rising and the housing market has been changing in those areas for some time now. So given what we hear, particularly in the context of the election campaign, does any of that surprise you? Jenna, I'd start with you on that question.
Well, I love the fact that your survey shows us that people of our generation are now engaged with climate change, because my God, for a long time I've been hearing that, you know, old people don't care about the climate because they're all about to die. This is extremely frustrating to me because I am not about to die, and I'm extremely concerned about the climate because my darling little grandchildren, and I'm sorry I don't have an immediate photo to hand to show you how much I'm committed to their having a safe world to live in. I also think I would like to say that any of the research that's done from the big polling organisations who interview thousands of people show that older people are concerned about climate change. It's the number one thing that worries them, because it's not just, you know, this kind of idea that boomers and the silent generation and Generation X are selfish is not borne out by what happens. And I'm thinking now about the way we interact with our families. I mean, it's very clear to me that women my age and also men are highly engaged with the lives of their children and their grandchildren. We are doing the childcare because childcare is unaffordable. I really, you know, I always appreciated childcare workers, never so much as when I had to pick up a squirming 18-kilo baby. And I really appreciate the fact that, for instance, Labor is considering a better job of making childcare more affordable. If there's ever a party that works towards free universal childcare, they will get my vote. I guess the other thing that does not surprise me is that women particularly are concerned about housing and accommodation, because, you know, it's my generation that finds it very difficult, particularly if they have become divorced. We know that divorce is the thing that catapults women into poverty. I absolutely hate the idea of having to sell my house to downsize, because my house is constantly full of both my children and my grandchildren. And in fact, I think at least one of my kids is moving back home with her entire entourage, because it's extremely difficult to get into the housing market. There needs to be a party that addresses availability of accommodation, not just this idea that selling the big houses is going to fix the problems for first home buyers. It will not fix the problems for first home buyers. So I'm more despairing about any party actually having a fix. I'm happy to think that there might be, well, both Labor and Liberal are trying to address you know, home affordability, but I actually think governments need to be building accommodations, social housing, either at state or federal level, because that is an urgent requirement for Australians. We need somewhere to live, whether we own or whether we rent, whether we can't even afford very much in rent. That is, I would say, a crucial challenge. And I don't think either party is doing a great job of addressing that.
Thanks, Jenna. I agree. I think I've really noticed in the last few days that we don't talk about rental at all. And in fact, there are many people who choose to rent for lots of reasons. One is affordability, but actually, you know, some people are attracted to renting for other things that it offers them, and you know, other ways that they might use their income. So I do think that we really miss big chunks of that housing debate, but we'll get into that a bit more further down. Lex, did anything surprise you or stand out particularly when you were reading the report?
Well, there's a couple of points I'd make. Firstly, I'd like to take a step backwards and acknowledge that I live and work on Camaragal land, and I'd like to pay my respect to their elders. I also should politically declare a conflict of interest. I'm actively campaigning for one of the independents. So now to the broader question. I wasn't greatly surprised. I mean, the one area that I'll probably come back to that I was surprised was the small response from so-called CALD, culturally and linguistically diverse participants. But in general terms, I agree with Jenna. It seems self-evident to me that climate change is the biggest issue, and it's an existential issue beyond which the other issues become irrelevant. If that's not resolved, then it doesn't matter what you think about the other issues. It's climate change has to be, and it is about not being selfish. And like Jenna, I'm worried about the legacy that my generation leaves our grandchildren. I don't want them to be cursing on my grave as they blister in the unlivable conditions, saying, "Why didn't you do something about it?" And it's a legitimate question. Why don't we do something about it? And it requires active participation from our government. I mean, in terms of government and in terms of the survey, generally, the government, it's almost as though it's ironically called the House of Representatives, because it's anything but. It doesn't represent us in terms of gender. It doesn't represent us in terms of cultural background. It doesn't represent us in terms of age. So it's become, and that gap between who it does represent and who it doesn't represent, the widening of that gap, I think, is a critical test of our democracy, to rectify that lack of representation in so many areas. And until that happens, I think it's hard to get these issues to advance. But certainly, I have no question that climate change is the #1 issue. Homelessness still befuddles me, how a developed country such as ours can have and tolerate such a high level of homelessness. Seems shameful to me. Housing affordability, I mean, you know, we've struggled to try and help our kids get a foot in the market, but I just know the pressure on them, and you know, the knock-on effect that has with grandchildren daycare. And you know, once again, I mean, I guess my wife and I are working harder now than we probably did when we had full-time jobs, because but it's compounded by the fact that longevity, which by definition is a good thing, longevity, as we live longer, we have more and more intergenerational relationships. It's not uncommon now for 4 generations of one family to not only exist, but have to find a way to live together in a family house. And then also the care responsibilities, and are not just in terms of the grandchildren, which is pretty all encompassing anyway, but there's a generation above us that many of us are having to care for as well. So it's compounded by that. So I think they're the issues that really affect me. But until, you know, unless climate change is resolved, the rest of the issues become irrelevant.
I think I would agree with you there, Lex. I think it's particularly stark when you look at the number of natural disasters we've had in the last few years and how many people have been made homeless by those, or, you know, those kinds of knock-on effects. That you're exactly right, that is kind of this overriding issue that we all need to really be thinking about and resolving. Auntie Norma, what about for you? Is there anything in the report that you thought was surprising?
Surprising, no, but first of all, Yama, I just want to acknowledge all of those people who are out there on Aboriginal land, which is all of Australia. Hi, Faye. Long time no see. Long time no see. Yeah.
How are you doing, Auntie Norma?
Yeah, very well, thank you. And I see Dominic Wykenek has jumped on too and given us some resources to look at. But thank you for inviting me, Megan. Climate change. I find it absolutely fascinating. You know, for 60,000 years, we First Nations people have been looking after the land. And in such recent times where it may not have been looked after as well as we could, and that's not the total responsibility of Aboriginal people. And if we see quite recently with those rivers out west, and that was not just Mother Nature, that was also greed. I've been telling people that little story about Tiddalik the frog, the greedy little frog that took up all the water, and they had to be tickled on the tummy to let all that water out. That's a story that we tell to children about greed. And that's what I see out there, and particularly in Western New South Wales, it can be very dry. But there's always been water in our rivers. You know, for Aboriginal people, we're either fresh water or salt water. Water is important. Without water, we die. That's just a fact. So without water, we die. And when you dry up those rivers, that affects so many other things in terms of climate change. And that climate change comes back to human activities, not just what's happening out there, but it's human activities about taking care of our what we talk about, our Aboriginal family is not just the human families, it's all about the others, it's the animals, it's the, you know, it's the plants, it's the trees, our grandmother trees. We have to take care of that. And, you know, I do Aboriginal Welcome to Country, and we acknowledge country is, and welcome to country is not just about the land, it's about everything else, Aboriginal, our culture, our people, and all of that's acknowledged. I'm on Gadigal land. I've been here for a long time. I'm from a little town called Cowra, Midwestern New South Wales. And when you look at those, what's happening on our land, it's absolutely, it makes you want to cry, you know. I won't go so far as to say Mother Nature is slapping the people up in the north, you know, in the face with all these rains and everything. And then, but we have to stop and think about the repercussions of us maybe not looking after the land as well as we should have and could have. And that does affect a whole lot of other things. Jenna talked about, you know, housing, how, you know, the North Coast and Southeast Queensland, that affects living, housing, everything. If you're homeless, my God, you know, in this great, big, wonderful country of ours, nobody should go homeless. And certainly people who, like older people who have put so much into life and have done so much and looked after the younger generations, as Jenna talked about, surely to goodness, this country is strong enough and rich enough to be able to support our elders so that none of our elders become homeless. I mean, things can happen in other countries. Let's have a look at some of these models to make sure that our elders are not homeless, because with all of that, it's about safety. It's about elders' safety. Elder abuse is a major issue that, you know, we have to make sure that our elders are not being abused, but they're being protected. So when you look at elders, you know, we think of our family first. We think of our community before we think of ourselves. We as elders, we always put ourselves last. I mean, I love what Jenna was talking about, the grandchildren, because I have 2 granddaughters and I have 3 great-grandchildren. I want to make sure, I want to know that, you know,
I'm a bit jealous.
A little boy and 2 little girls, Jenna. Absolutely gorgeous. So there's a whole raft of issues, Megan, that come out with just those issues that we've been talking about, you know, with childcare. I was one of the people who started off our very first Marawina preschool way back in the 1970s, where it was fully run by Aboriginal people for Aboriginal children. Look, and I'll tell you, with all of this too comes what we're talking about quite recently is Aboriginal identity. It's becoming a really major issue of what that's all about. And I won't go into that because we can be talking all day. Housing, look, housing is about self-worth. If you're in a home and you're protected and you've got a roof over your head, you're able to have a meal on the table, that's about self-worth, which is about safety, about you feeling safe, but also really knowing that your family is safe as well. Because with homelessness, and if you're not okay, and we'd mentioned about COVID-19, where people feel quite isolated, because I know we as Aboriginal people, we're very gregarious. We love our family, and I'm totally sure that so many others too. So when you're as an elder, with COVID, if you're locked up when you're used to, you know, seeing your family, coming back out of that now is causing all sorts of dramas and problems, health issues, spiritual issues, about that connections and that connectivity that we have to think about. I'll just touch very, 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 very quickly is about death and dying. So as elders, we need to think about that stuff. We need to think about what does that mean for our offsprings and our next generation. I've just had a beautiful sister in her, was in her 80s, and she just passed away recently. But you know, she had her own home and everything. She passed away. She had to go into a nursing home. So there's big changes. I think Jen had mentioned something about that. There's big changes in that, but there's psychological changes too, and spiritual changes. So these, I think, are some of the issues that is a little bit touchy, but I think we really need to talk about it. And that's why I love our program, our organisation, Wayenga, which means Mother Earth, that I'm on the board, the chairperson, and we try very hard to look after our elders, both in their homes or wherever they may be, and keep them safe. And that really sense of worth and that sense of safety. So, yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Auntie Norma. I think one of the things you picked up there, and I haven't got it down to talk about later, is around COVID-19 and how that has really affected older people in lots of different ways to the rest of the community, I think. And, you know, we really see in our work that there's a bit of a split now, but there's a group of older people who are really still quite fearful about being out in the community. And so that's really affecting them in lots of different ways. As you say, it's an emotional thing, it's a physical thing. People aren't exercising the way that they used to because they don't want to go outside. So, you know, the long-term effects of that, I think, are going to go on for some time. And it is something that people are really keen to see that we're still addressing.
And it's more than that, it's that physical connectedness with your family and with other people at their front. That physical connectedness is just so important.
Because this is fine, right? We can all talk this way, but it's not actually the same as being in the room with someone. And I think people have missed that a great deal. So I want to move on now. Karen, if you could pop up that slide about climate change. We've all touched on it and talked about it to some extent already. But in terms of the environment, the survey provided 8 key environmental challenges seems to be flying through this. There it is, that's the one. 8 environmental challenges, and asked participants to rank the issues from 1 to 8. Climate change was top ranked, followed by drought and drying and loss of plant and animal species. It showed that a significant majority of older people believe that climate change is happening, although fewer believe that it is mainly due to human activity. There's also a decline in the acceptance of climate change in older cohorts and people who are less supportive of Australia doing more to reduce carbon emissions. The top selected government actions were around the introduction of policies to encourage the use of new low carbon technologies, supporting the community to prepare and adapt for extreme weather events, and adopting a net zero target by 2050. Women were more supportive of government action, as were people in the 50 to 59 year age group, higher income earners, metropolitan and rural out of town respondents. So one of the things that I found really interesting there, because I think, you know, when we talk about public policy issues at the moment, often, you know, we look for, or politicians and people look for the issues that divide us rather than the things that bring us together and that we can work together on. So one of the things that I found really interesting in those statistics there was that older people outside of major centres were more supportive of action on climate change than those people in regional centres. So, you know, people in Dubbo are less supportive of action than people in, say, Bourke. And I find that, I mean, I think those people often see a lot of the effect of climate change. It's the stuff that Auntie Norma was talking about, those rivers that used to have water and in fact 3 years ago were just puddles in the ground really out west. So I think part of it is that, you know, very much connectedness to the environment. But are there other things that might explain that from your thinking, Faye?
It's a good question. It's an unexpected, in some ways, outcome, but I also would suspect it might be connected to the fact that some of the demographics you're talking, or the locations you're thinking about, may have been distracted by the impact of climate change during the implementation of the survey, the fieldwork.
That is possibly true, yes.
Yes. I mean, you look at this, if you look at it from a political context, and see how the perception of climate change has shifted over the last 4 or 5 years. In 2019, the Morrison government was re-elected partly because they were able to reframe climate change as a jobs issue. And today, they still have in their policy platform, what would be called their climate change policies are actually entitled Our Plan for More Australian Jobs. So they have convinced a whole range of people in marginal seats that their job was more important than this mythical climate change activity, which now has been debunked by the reality of lived experience for a lot of those people, in which, you know, they don't worry about their job at the mine anymore. They worry that their house is underwater. So the reality of climate change is happening, and it's happening faster. Now, whether or not, and so depending on what region you come from, that reality is hit in a really startling way. So the can that you've been kicking down the road, doesn't really matter how far it's got, the road has risen up and whacked you in the face. So that's, I think, where that kind of a result would come from. I don't think any Australian who's been paying attention believes that we can avoid climate change. I don't think any Australian believes that it's not happening. What they sometimes like to tell themselves is that it's not climate change, it's just that the climate is changing. It's a bizarre nuance, but it gives them comfort. You know, I look at it though, and I have to refrain myself from saying, you know what, if we keep having these once in 100-year events, I'm going to be 700. It's going to become the new dog years.
Yeah.
So it is, but the challenge is always going to be to change. And this is where it becomes politically challenging. I think some parties are better than others, and the Greens like to say that they've got a good plan. Actually, they don't have a realistic plan, because the transition is painful for way more people than you can reasonably expect. You know, it's supposed to say, we can cure you, but we'll kill you during the cure, but your cadaver will be really nice and clean. So it's the process we need, and we need to make it a realistic, shared transition plan. That's going to be our challenge. And I think one of the encouraging things, like everybody else that I found from this, is I think this study debunks that view that older Australians are selfish, which I know I suspect came from that, what was it? It was the 2006 New South Wales government study that did this thing that basically came out. So we don't care about climate change was the takeaway from this report. Not caring is completely at odds with everybody's lived experience about the older people in their family. Everybody, who do you love most? You love your grandmum and granddad most, because they just shower love on you. They care more. That period we went through where we thought the baby boomers were selfish, that was because they weren't prepared to give a kidney. It was this, oh, what do you mean you want to go on holidays instead of buying me a car? I mean, seriously, get a bit of perspective. I think our lived experience and the actual experience at a social level of the generosity and the investment that older Australians have in the future is huge. In fact, I suspect and there is people whose interests are served by trying to propagate a false competitiveness with younger Australians, as if, it's a binary discussion, where in actual fact it's a shared agenda.
That is such a great segue. It's like we almost scripted that one, Faye. Thank you. The next slide I'm going to ask Karen to share is the one about intergenerational opportunity. And what we found in the survey is that that the results really do challenge that idea of that intergenerational conflict narrative. And as Faye says, and I think it's my experience working in this space for a long time now, is that in fact older people are, very often related to younger people, and so they do care about what happens next and what they leave behind. And I think it's been well represented by everyone who's spoken already today. It's really one of my constant bugbears that politicians use this perceived competition between generations to divide and conquer over important issues, which just lets them get away with not actually coming up with good responses to policy problems. So it is very clear from this survey that older people find or believe that they had better social and economic opportunities than younger people do now, and that they're most concerned about that in the context of housing, but also climate change and things like HECS debts. Just knowing that younger people are starting behind the 8 ball before they start getting to housing, they're paying off, really significant debts if they go to university. And like all of the panelists have represented today, they're very concerned about the climate that they leave for their children and their grandchildren to deal with into the future. So we do see, though, that the framing of so much policy debate is all about advantaging one generation over another. And I've read even just this week, and obviously it's in relation to the housing announcements that were made during the campaign over the weekend. How do we change this kind of framing? How do we, start to frame things in a way that sees that there is actually a generational aspect to a lot of these issues, but actually that some of the solutions can be multi-generational rather than competitional. And I might start with you on that one, Jenna.
So I guess the thing I would like to say, and I've been saying this for about 2 weeks and I've already addressed it when I spoke earlier, but the very first thing we can do to stop this kind of backbiting and competition is to address housing. It is absolutely crucial. And as Faye and Norma and Lex have all said, and you, this has got to go all the way from renting, even short-term renting, all the way through to some way of ensuring that we can stay in our houses while we need to stay in our houses, and then dispose of them to the next person who's going to live with 3 generations. So I think that's the first thing we need to do. Once we've got rid of that, I mean, there is no question that the younger generation, and when I say younger, anyone under 65, have had a terrible time with housing, particularly over the last 15 years. It's really difficult. And I've seen with my own eyes, trying to get my own 3 kids into the market somehow, it's very tough. And they've got 2 middle-class parents who are really happy to give them the clothes off their backs, but not everyone is in that extremely privileged position of being able to be the bank of mum and dad. And I think that sets generation against generation. And I think in a way that also is what the coalition enjoys. It enjoys that kind of conflict we have and trying to divide rather than unite. I'm not entirely sure that this Labor policy of the government owning half the house is going to work either, but you know, addressing that problem of housing is going to stop the intergenerational fighting. That's number one thing. I guess the other thing I would say is that I can see myself that there are many women of my generation and older who are struggling with the care aspects. And as Lex really rightly pointed out, I mean, until last year, I was looking after my mother-in-law, trying to look after my children. And then, of course, we had the 2 grandchildren arrive. And that is really extremely stressful for someone my age. I mean, I know I look okay, but I'm no spring chicken. The knees are going, the lower back, my God, thank God for physios. I can see that in some families that causes a lot of conflict. And I mean, I'm happy, really not just happy, delighted to be able to contribute to looking after my grandsons, but it's hard on people. And it's really, you know, there is no way to get any kind of compensation for that, although the love is a ginormous compensation, but excluding grandparents from getting any kind of financial support, I think is a problem, while at the same time making it very expensive for the younger generation to ever get into childcare. I mean, it's hundreds of dollars a week. Both my daughter and her partner work full time. It's extremely financially difficult, especially now they're trying to deal with mortgage, and their mortgage is small in comparison to some of their friends. So these are 2 key areas where we can think about reducing intergenerational conflict. I think now that we see how committed the older generation, and, you know, hooray to the knitting nanas, how committed the older generation now is to kind of thinking about climate change, even if they don't quite accept that it's human induced. I think that is also going to make a more intergenerational, harmonious experience. But I think some of these things are designed, politically designed, for us to be at war with each other and at odds with each other. We need to reject that kind of divisive politics and accept that there are things we can do to make these generations work together for the same purpose, which is a better, fairer, more equal kind of life. We all want that. And it's trying to address the numerous elements to resist that kind of political anger making, I would call it.
Thanks, Jenna. There's a comment in the questions from Roy Starkey, who I happen to know. Roy lives up in Lismore. He's seeing some of these housing issues firsthand at the moment, having been flooded twice in the last few weeks. And one of the things that he's saying is about changing that. What maybe one of the goals or the ways of doing this is changing the myth of the great Australian dream of home ownership, and actually working towards making renting affordable and an acceptable kind of option, and safe for people to actually make long-term plans on the basis of a lease which might go longer than 6 to 12 months. And maybe that's one of the approaches we need to be looking at.
I guess I mean, I was hoping that I had addressed that. I think we do a terrible job by renters in this country. In Europe, there are protections for renters. There are 10-year leases. And I had the really great fortune of being able to do some international traveling in between, not having to pay $1 zillion for my actual children and then, you know, worrying about traveling. We went to Venice. We discovered those palazzos were filled with renters, and they were on fixed term rental, and their landlords were taking care of those beautiful places. And I mean, we need something like that. We cannot have this thing where, I mean, I don't know how many of you were watching, I think the 7 p.m. news on the ABC the night before last, but this young man was being ejected from house after house because his landlords knew they could get more money. Well, that has got to stop. I felt like asking him who the landlord was and going around there and giving him a shout. Even though
He was in Orange, Jenna, so you can head out for a weekend or something
that's a
and
lovely
see if you
idea.
can resolve that.
Get into a few fights.
I think one of the other things that kind of surprised me in the results was that there was an interesting counter view to the question of young people having it tougher. And that was particularly amongst women who thought that younger generations, particularly younger generations of women, had more opportunities. Now we've got, you know, a few feminists on the panel today. I'm going to ask you, Auntie Norma, what do you reckon? Do you reckon younger women have had a better shot at this than women from your era or mine? You're on mute at the moment.
Me and technology, we just don't love each other at the moment. It just always, it's just, look, as you're talking and kind of just evading your question, Megan, but the cost of living today is just outrageous, and it's getting worse. And I don't think it's just because of the wars overseas. You know, if I'm on a pension, I don't get much, but if I go across to my local shop now, even to get the basics like bread and butter and milk, it cost me about $50. It's just, you know. So as I was thinking about that, as Jenna was talking, and I'm thinking about our history of and our legacy that's been left to us. I was born and raised on an Aboriginal reserve. My poor old mother was a pensioner, so we came down to Sydney when I was about 11. So my mother wasn't a millionaire. She didn't have an inheritance. I didn't have an inheritance that other people may have. And so when you think about those social issues of housing, health, education, and what's been left for the next generation, I know for now that there are Aboriginal people who were able to get good jobs, even some home ownerships. But that's not all of us. That's maybe a few people. So that legacy, we weren't millionaires. We weren't big landowners. We didn't have all of those big dollars that we're able to then give to our next generation, to our kids. And you even go back to like HECS fees. When I was going to school, to uni, we didn't have HECS fees. Yay. But these are added debts that's put onto the next generation. And you know what, I can see how they can complain about it. And maybe some of them have to do 2 or 3 jobs. And that's just to pay for the HECS fees. That's not even to put down a deposit for housing in this wonderful government that says, well, you know, take it out of your super, that's fine. Well, you know, super is for us is really just a recent phenomenon as well. So how many people, you know, of my generation that may have a couple of $1 million in their super that they can take out to put down a deposit, as the government is saying you can do. So I think there's a lot of issues around that, but I do watch a little bit of American TV, and I see that one of the philosophies that American parents have is that they have got a saving fund for their children's college. My mother had 11 children. She'd be flat out putting any money away for her children's college fund.
Be a very small fund.
And I see today that, yeah, the younger ones, you know, the next generations, second and third generations, you know, they may be doing it a little bit harder. For the people who I know, I can't talk about people who have an inheritance and, you know, been able to pass that on or receive that from their parents or their grandparents, or received a house that they don't have to pay rent for, or all of that. But I'm talking about a lot of people who I know. This is a really big, it's a big burden for them. So I certainly didn't have enough money to give my children and my grandchildren an inheritance, and there's a lot like this. So, you know, some of those next generations may have to do 2 or 3 jobs to get going, but like they say, you know, get out and do it. It may help you.
I think I saw
it may
an
help
article.
you build character.
Well, I saw an article yesterday, though, that starts to talk about housing as not being necessarily just about generational difficulties, but actually about class difficulties. And I think that's really what you're pointing to there, that there are a group of people who will, younger people who will be able to own homes because they can dip into the bank of mum and dad, or you know, have access to funds that way. And then there's a group of people who just will never have that opportunity, and so they will be left behind. Did you want to jump in, Faye?
If I could, Megan, I think one of the things to remember about this is whether there's perception or not, the reality is it is actually harder for younger people today. Not only do they have a housing market, you look back, if you're fortunate enough to own your own home, think about what proportion of your wage you had to pay the mortgage. That home may have increased in value almost 50 times in the times of the wages that young people today access, nowhere near that. In fact, the increased casualisation of their employment makes it harder for them to get a loan in the first place. We also have structural inequalities in our tax system that makes it harder for them. Whether you like it or not, negative gearing serves the wealthy. Whether you like it or not, a whole range of subsidies and support that the government gives benefits older Australians over younger Australians. I think it is a real danger because it can be weaponised politically, this great divide between the reality and the opportunity. And we've now got also $1 trillion debt that, whether you like it or not, most people who are listening in today are not going to be paying much off on. So it's their debt. That now the economy is supposed to grow magically like a pudding, and it's all supposed to be fine. But in actual fact, the very thought of it is oppressive for these younger people. They are putting off having children. They are having to move away from friends and family to find a house they can buy. They are making decisions which you did not have to make at their age based on economic constraints. So I think we need to respect that and say at some point there needs to be a forum in which you can have a reasonable discussion about this. I suspect that one of the things that they're going to advocate for if they get the opportunity is some kind of government inquiry into intergenerational fairness in our regulatory environment. And I think it's it's a worthwhile investigation to make.
Oh, that's excellent, Faye.
I agree.
Totally agree with all of what you just said.
Lex, did you want to jump in there?
Well, indeed. I mean, I'm listening with a great deal of, I'm enthralled. The notion of intergenerational conflict I find absolutely repugnant, and maybe it's because of my cultural background, but it's never been an issue within my family to that extent, because we tend to think of the family as a unit and how do we best pool our resources among generations in order for all of us to achieve a little bit of what we want, rather than separating and hiving bits off here and there. And so we've only ever tried to find solutions that benefit all of us, which is the best path that as a family unit we can progress.
Lex, I think that's so right. But the current government has not created a forum in which people can come together and have that. And I think that's the critical enabler. Sorry, Jenna. Sorry, Megan.
Please.
That was just me agreeing and waving, but also saying the best example of them trying to divide the community was the attacks on removing negative gearing and franking credits at the last election. That was catastrophically bad. It was such great policy, and the Liberal Party through Tim Wilson mounted a raging fear campaign, and that was so divisive and continues to be damaging to our economy today and to the housing needs of the young people in the future and currently.
And look, we were going through a similar process to this survey at the time that was being debated 3 years ago. And the vast majority of older people were not affected by it and did not have a huge concern about it. And yet it became such a magnified issue in that election campaign. It was just craziness. I am going to move us forward. Sorry, Auntie Norma,
very quickly.
No, you're right.
You do mention social, but I still will say a lot of this is cultural and racist. You know, because when I came down to Sydney, I was born and raised on the Aboriginal Reserve under the Aboriginal Welfare Act. We were totally controlled by the mission manager and the state government under that act. And when we were allowed to come to Sydney, we didn't have any money for our background, you know, to go and rent houses. So when we came down, we had to live with other family members. Landlords wouldn't rent us, you know, houses because because we were Aboriginal. So if you don't have a roof over your head, that could affect your health affects your working and all of that. So I love what Lex said, you know, with his culture about how the sharing and that, but we, you know, it was, I just think that that first start for our generation as a younger one, I think that was based on racism, not social.
No, I can't disagree with you there. And I think, again, it's almost like we scripted this or something today, because you've just given me a really nice segue to my next slide, which was to talk about Indigenous recognition.
Sorry, can I just leap in just before we go on?
Of course you can.
Thank you. One of the participants is a person called Heather Craven. And I just want to read her comment because it's so beautiful. She says, without a home, you cannot do all the other things you need to do. Sleep safely, shower, present yourself for employment. Our welfare not-for-profit organisations are putting in the hard work to support this cohort of people. Thank goodness. 100% agree, and I'll be quiet now, sorry.
Thank you for picking that up, because I hadn't seen that one, and it is a great comment on what we're discussing here. We are going to move on to this next slide, which is talking about Indigenous recognition. And it's an issue that's been debated for some time now in the context of the Uluru Statement, which was released in 2017. This data shows really strong support, almost 82% support for constitutional recognition. There's also very high support for the measures that meet the Close the Gap targets, a treaty with Indigenous Australia, and the establishment of an Indigenous voice for Parliament, which is one of the things that's been debated in the last week of the election campaign. Or at least mentioned. I won't say debated because it hasn't been acknowledged by all parties. So many of the people who took this survey remember the 1967 referendum. I'm sure Auntie Norma does, and remember kind of the environment at that time. And many of the opinion polls, when people are asked about Indigenous recognition, demonstrate broad support amongst the whole population, not just older people, for Indigenous recognition. How do you think we go at this point about progressing this issue? And I'm going to start with you, Auntie Norma, because I think that would be the most respectful thing to do. But I also think that it's really important to hear how you think we kind of change this debate and convince politicians that this is something that needs to happen, given that so many people in the electorate broadly agree that it should.
First of all, as our lovely elder up in the Northern Territory who we've just lost says, I am not the problem, right? So people just always tend to say it's an Aboriginal problem. It's up to the Aboriginal people to sort this out. Yeah, it's very important for us to be part of the conversation and perhaps even lead that conversation. But we're only 3%, you know, of the Australian population. And as you said, in 1967 was the first time that we were counted as citizens of this country. There's a lot of history there. Right, going back to when the tall ships come in, you know, to Sydney Cove, there's a lot of history there where you know, the massacres and pock blankets that was given to the local Gadigal people. From right there till now, there's been a lot of history of what government has done to us or for us on our behalf, and also the Aboriginal responses, I guess, and what we think and thought, because, you know, I was part of the Aboriginal Tent Embassy, all of that, what Aboriginal people tried to do. My family was part of that in the 1930s, fighting for Aboriginal citizens' rights. The history is there, but don't always say it, you know, blame it on the Aboriginal people. It's their problem. Let them solve the problem, because it's not an Aboriginal problem. And
you're right. And I shouldn't have asked it in that context, because I think you must be exhausted. It's been going on for a really long time. Lex, how do we change it? How do we progress it? It is our job.
Well,
Norma's right.
Well, clearly we need to use issues such as this to find a way of uniting us rather than using them to divide us. And that's it. Until it's a no-brainer, and for a country, a nation like ours, which is unique in terms of its cultural diversity, unless we can find reconciliation with our First Nations, then we have no chance of being able to live together harmoniously. That needs to be the starting point. And to fabricate it into some other grab for power, a third chamber of decision, you know, it just obfuscates the argument in a way that I don't understand who benefits from it. And you know, we absolutely must have this recognition before we can progress as a society that deals with cultural diversity on a wider level.
Lex, we can't even come together to talk about the 26th of January as Australians.
Well, exactly.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, Auntie Norma, because it's the one thing that was really not, well, it was not nearly as highly supported as the other things that we asked people. So we asked about treaty, we asked about recognition, we asked about a voice to parliament, all of those things supported. Australia Day, not. And I have to say that I do not understand our cultural attachment to this particular day. I really, really don't understand why, if it offends a group of people, that we would keep doing that. But
beer
that
and
is the one thing.
Beer and sangers, Megan.
We get it. We get a sanger on election day as well. Can't we just have more sausage sizzles on election day and get rid of the 26th of January?
Well,
Faye,
unfortunately,
I want to ask you a question here. Sorry, Lex, but I want to ask Faye about, you know, this is another issue, and I would say things like marriage equality are very similar, where there is a really stark difference. Voluntary assisted dying would be another one, where there's a really stark difference between what people believe, and it's consistently shown in polls and surveys and research, and then what actually gets enacted by government. How the hell do we shift these debates to a point where we actually get action and resolve some of them? Because I think the community is more than ready.
It's a good point, but I think there's a couple of spheres of activity that play into this. One is people say they're ready for change, but they don't actually want to be disrupted. And I think the 26th of January is a great example of that. Oh yeah, we should, you know, I want all this difference, but I don't actually want anything really that disrupts what I like. And then the other one is politicians are not brave. Okay, they're not. I mean, marriage equality was a classic example. We went through that national, you know, upheaval so that 6 people could cross the chamber without consequence. The fact they all rushed over in the end, that's just typical. But it was really about giving 6 people crowd cover. So there's never actually been major change in Australia that has been led by politicians. They usually, I think the voluntary assisted dying debate is a classic example. I mean, after going through 10 hours of exhaustive, everybody standing on their soapbox in New South Wales, they still couldn't bring themselves to vote on it. As if everybody needs to hear everybody's reason why. Just do the job and move on, I say. So that's kind of like the 2 challenges. And people keep looking to politicians to lead. And you should just stop doing that. All our big changes happen because politicians have no choice. Even the BCA is forced to lead in, you know, to take the responsibility away from the government. So, but also people need to be honest with themselves. I liked this study because you had such a large sample. I think it was genuinely honest with themselves, with the participants, respondents were genuinely honest with themselves. However, the thing to remember is people actually don't know most of the time why they support something. They kind of support it and then rationalize it later. So asking somebody to rationally respond, expecting the response to reflect a rational disposition is not accurate. That's why the strength of the result is what you look to. So the fact that it is such a dominant gut reaction to say is, yes, I believe we must do something about climate. Yes, I believe we must do something about recognising First Peoples. But the hard part is then saying, okay, here's your desire. How do we implement? That's where there's opportunity to divide and conquer and conflict and all those kind of good things. That's why we're not a republic. That's why we don't have a price on carbon.
That's the classic example. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. I always, when I do these things, and Joan's leading, wonder why she can't keep them to time. But my experience of actually running them is that they're impossible to keep to time, and we really have to keep pushing through. I want to touch really briefly on cultural diversity, because I think, again, it's one of those issues that can divide us. A lot of public debate at the moment, it focuses on culture and what is the culture of Australia, who gets opportunities, who doesn't. Auntie Norma encapsulated it really well when she was talking about her move into the city. But again, these results demonstrate that the vast majority of older people believe that cultural diversity is a positive influence on Australia, with almost 80% of people thinking that culturally diverse communities should enjoy and celebrate their own culture and share it with others. And I think there's been a really great example of that recently with the Eid celebrations going on in Western Sydney, where, you know, 1 million people a night were heading out to Lakemba to take part in those celebrations over that time. Migrants in earlier eras were very much expected to assimilate into the dominant culture. Do you think it's changed much, Lex? Have we moved? Are people, you know, more accepting now of people bringing their culture here and us having a larger cultural pot?
I think the rhetoric has changed more than the practice. I think there's an acknowledgement and an awareness of other cultures in a way that was not part of the old assimilationist policy. But I think the reality is that most younger generations that I talk to from non-Anglo backgrounds, for want of a better word, they know what racism is. They experience it on all kinds of passive and subtle levels, much as the way we're starting to experience ageism on subtle and different levels. I think we have made progress, and I don't want to be negative about it. But I also see, you know, when I come back to the non-representative House of Representatives, I mean, that I find is extraordinary. And given that both major parties had opportunities to elect local candidates for pre-selection, local candidates from diverse backgrounds, and chose instead not to. And I think that's a real flaw in the political system. And I think while ever that flaw remains in politics, it inevitably bleeds into the wider society. And I think there are still, you know, we talk about January the 26th, as whether it's the appropriate day or not. The fact is that January 26th has been hijacked by a white supremacist minority. You know, and I mean, I find it ridiculous that is allowed to be, you know, the flying of flags and that kind of jingoism is just, I find that so damaging in terms of social coherence, that cohesion, that why it's endorsed, I have no idea. But I mean, things have improved, so I don't want to be a doomsayer all my life, but things have improved. But you know, in my business, it's hard for ethnic kids to get a gig. You know,
I think that's true, and I really agree with you in terms of that equivalence to ageism, because I think they're quite similar things in how they, you know, we've got laws that say it's not legal, but these things still happen. And, you know, if you're looking in things like jobs, hiring and blind hiring practices are very hard to get people to adopt, and it just does mean that you don't get that diversity across the board. I also take your point about the House of Reps, because it isn't, is it at all?
Well, it's like the old argument about privilege. You know, everyone says, oh, you know, Australia is such an egalitarian society. There's no privilege. The only people who say that there's no experience of privilege are those who have it.
Yes.
I think it's really interesting. My parents were Holocaust survivors. They came to Australia in 1951. They were forced to change their name when they arrived in Sydney. POLONYPREISCZ was considered way too hard. And I think there has been constant anti-Semitism in Australia, hardly ever peddled back in any way, shape or form. But I thought to myself, you know, my children are going to be okay. They don't express their Judaism in any kind of strong, or one does, but the other two don't. Anyhow, lo and behold, my darling son-in-law is a Filipino. And when, you know, he and my laggardly daughter finally provided me with grandchildren, I had these 2 great grandchildren, and I went across the road. I think Levi must have been about 6 weeks old or maybe 8 weeks old. And one of our neighbours looked over at him and said, "Is he Asian or is he beautiful?" And I was so appalled. I was so appalled by this that I mean, normally I would give someone like this a solid slap in the head, but I actually had tears spring to my eyes, and I just said, you know, I stumbled off, but I ended up writing about it. I always write about the things that upset me and write out my feelings. But I mean, I think we are shockingly racist. I had a great idea about January 26th that I thought would overcome all this, which was, in Judaism, we have a holy day called Yom Kippur, which is a day of atonement. And I thought, brilliant, we are going to turn January 26 into a Day of Atonement. Yes, I couldn't get any takers. I had various people ringing me and saying that is the most ridiculous idea ever. But you could have the Day of Atonement, 2 days later, you could have, you know, whatever we want to do to be thankful for this country taking us, because I am still very grateful. When all other countries wouldn't take Jews, Australia would take Jews. To accept and acknowledge that, but also to honour First Nations people and their terrible loss. But I couldn't get it to fly. Sorry, people.
I mean, it's an interesting debate, because I'm actually confused these days. What are we actually celebrating on June the 26th?
We're not.
I mean, I'm completely confused as to know what is the appropriate reaction, because I'm not sure what we're supposedly celebrating.
Well, I have to say, as someone on this panel who has multiple convicts in my heritage, I've never really been sure either, because I'm pretty sure none of them wanted to come. So I find it a very, very strange celebration, that one. We are going to have to start getting to the wrap up. I'm really sorry, Norma.
All right, I'd just like to comment that I love the diversity that we have in this country. I love the cultures, the languages, particularly for my people who it was against the law to practice, speak our language or practice our culture. And I love it. And I think I might have been the only Aboriginal person on the Ethnic Community Council that I was invited on there. And so, but the other thing we talk about these days is cultural safety, Megan. So that, you know, let's look at cultural safety, that wherever we are, in the classrooms, college, out in the communities, that it is okay for us to practice our cultures and to showcase those cultures and speak our language, whether it's on the buses, whether it's in the street or whatever, because I love it all.
Exactly. I am going to start to wrap us up now. We've talked about a lot of issues. The last question that I would like to put to all of you on the panel, the survey shows that that older people believe they have a moderate influence in politics and public policy, although people in rural towns and those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds feel they have less. There's a mixed level of civic engagement in terms of how people have chosen to engage over the last 12 months with civic debate. We all have a vote this weekend, or, you know, some of us have done it early, but that's the way that we get to show our opinion with these things. But how else can older people ensure that their local candidates are aware of their opinions and kind of the more diverse range of opinions of older people, rather than the kind of stale, stereotypical messages, I think, that they work from? I'm going to start with you, Auntie Norma. What do you reckon? One tip.
As one person who was a candidate for New South Wales state government.
Yes, as that one person.
And we don't have any Indigenous people in New South Wales state government in Parliament at all. Linda Burney went to Canberra, so, you know, not in our state government, so that influence is not there. But I always think that it's so important to be involved at that level, and you have to be out and about with the community. You have to be, you know, going to these functions, not just when it's, well, elections are coming up now, so what can I do to get out there, out and about in the community? And I'm in my community all the time. I have been trying to influence the next generation to come and get involved in politics, but again, for my people, it's that wariness of government and politics and police and all of that. So that kind of all is this, that psychological fear is still there, and they say, oh no, Art, you go and do that. You can do it. But I'll stay back here. But I have been trying, but you have to be there. You have to be in the community. You have to be at whatever functions you can go to. I know it's a lot of hard work, but it's no good coming just before elections and say, hey, vote for me, you know.
Lex, what do you reckon? How do we make sure
I think
politicians know this?
I think on all sorts of levels, social connection is really important. I think it's difficult these days. In a sense, the technology means that there's no excuse to be ill-informed, but there's every possibility you're going to be misinformed. And I think it's hard to find your way through that. So I think social connection is really important. I think it begins at that level and spreads its tentacles from there. But I don't think, you know, I don't think pulling down the cone of silence is a solution. I think you have to keep keep kicking.
Thank you. We didn't get, of course, to talk about everything in there, but there is a lot in the report about media and how older people get their messages. And I would urge people to go and have a look at the report. Jenna, what do you reckon?
Tweet early, tweet often, get onto Facebook, play with Instagram, talk to people in the communities, have discussion when you're at the local shops, talk to your kids about what you think matters. It's not just our responsibility as our generation to vote, but to persuade everyone to kind of vote for a community which is better connected, more harmonious and less conflict driven.
Excellent, thank you. And Faye?
I think I agree with Jenna, but I put a title over the top. Let's call it direct engagement. Actually go direct. If you see the representative in the shops, go over and talk to them. But also, they're human beings. So a constructive, positive conversation, not a vitriol and abuse because they've just been part of something you don't agree with. You're going to get a better reception if you say, listen, this and this happened, but I actually think there's a way through this. Or, you know, I applaud what you guys did in XYZ, because you have to reinforce the good like any toddler and correct the bad.
Yes, I think that's very true. I was thinking the same thing. I need to send some emails out after the VAD debate last night in the upper house, because there was some good stuff amongst the bad as I was listening at 11 o'clock last night. Anyway, that really brings us to the end of today's webinar. And I'm really sorry that we didn't have more time. Jenna asked me last night, will it really go for an hour and a half? I'm like, look, if we don't have anything to talk about, we'll finish earlier, but obviously we had plenty to keep us going. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope that you've all enjoyed the discussion, that you found it useful. If you're still to vote, maybe it's, you know, given you a different thought process before Saturday. I'd really like to thank our guest speakers. You've been so fantastic today. Thank you so much for joining us and for being so very generous with your time. There'll be an email going out to everyone tomorrow. If you've missed part of this, if you want your friends to watch it, it will be available on the YouTube channel from tomorrow afternoon. We do have a series of regular webinars. In June, we'll be focusing on my aged care, which is always such fun to talk about, but actually really important. So I'd encourage you to come along for that one as well. Remember that we have a band of community speakers who can come out and speak to your community group on a range of issues if you're interested in that. And thanks again for joining us today. I really appreciate your time, and I hope you've enjoyed the discussion. I think it's been fantastic. I have actually really enjoyed facilitating this one, and I do wish we'd set it up for, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours, so we really could have got into it. But thank you so much.
Very much. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Megan.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.